The winter wind cut through the Belgian countryside like a knife. It was December 1944, and somewhere in a modest command post, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was holding court with his British staff officers. The Americans, he said with barely concealed contempt, were moving too slowly. If only they'd shown more initiative, more aggression, the war might already be over. Word of Montgomery's attitude spread quickly through Allied headquarters. And when it reached Winston Churchill in London, the Prime Minister knew he had a crisis on his hands that could tear apart the alliance winning the war. Bernard Law Montgomery was born in 1887 to an Anglican bishop and his stern wife. From his earliest days, young Bernard was difficult. His mother once confessed that of all her 9 children, he was the most troublesome. He questioned authority, argued with everyone, and seemed incapable of admitting he might be wrong. At Sandhurst Military Academy, he graduated near the bottom of his class, not from lack of ability, but because he refused to follow rules he considered pointless. World War I changed him, but not in the way you might expect. A German sniper shot him through the lung in France. The doctors prepared his family for the worst. Montgomery survived through pure stubbornness, the same trait that would define his entire career. By the time World War II arrived, he'd become one of Britain's most experienced commanders. Thin, sharp-featured, with piercing eyes that rarely blinked, he neither smoked nor drank. Every night, regardless of the military situation, he went to bed at 9:30 sharp. In 1942, Britain desperately needed a victory. For 3 years, the news had been nothing but defeats and retreats. Then Churchill sent Montgomery to North Africa to stop German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel from capturing Egypt. Montgomery took command of the exhausted 8th Army, reorganized everything, and at El Alamein in October, delivered Britain's first major victory of the war. Church bells rang across the British Isles for the first time since 1940. Montgomery became a national hero, the man who finally proved British forces could beat the Germans. But success changed him. Or perhaps it just revealed what had always been there. His confidence became arrogance. His self-assurance became an absolute conviction that his way was the only right way. By June 1944, Montgomery commanded all Allied ground forces for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. On the 6th of June, American, British, and Canadian troops stormed 5 beaches under his overall command. Despite terrible casualties at Omaha Beach and fierce German resistance everywhere, the invasion succeeded. The Allies had returned to Europe. Then the problems started. Montgomery's plan called for British forces to capture Caen on the first day. This Norman city sat at a crucial road junction. Take Caen, and the Allies could break out into the French countryside and start the race to Germany. But the British didn't take Caen on D-Day. They didn't take it in the first week. It took over a month of grinding combat, and when British forces finally entered the city, most of it was smoking rubble. Meanwhile, American forces under General Omar Bradley fought through the hedgerows of Normandy. These weren't the neat hedges you see in English gardens. These were ancient walls of earth and roots, some of them growing since medieval times, surrounding every field. German defenders turned each one into a fortress. American troops advanced yard by yard, paying in blood for every field. Progress was agonizingly slow. Montgomery began making pointed comments. The Americans, he suggested privately to British colleagues, lacked aggression. Their generals were too cautious. If only they'd push harder, attack more boldly, the campaign would move faster. He seemed to forget that his own British forces were also struggling, that the Germans were fighting brilliantly, that war never goes according to plan. American commanders noticed. General George Patton, who led the U.S. Third Army, was a profane, pearl-handled pistol-wearing warrior who called Montgomery insufferable and refused to attend meetings where the British Field Marshal would be present. Even the diplomatic Omar Bradley started making dry comments about certain commanders who were quick to blame others for delays while explaining away their own. But Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower held the alliance together. Eisenhower was a Kansas farm boy who'd never commanded troops in combat before World War II. He'd risen through the ranks because he could make brilliant, difficult personalities work together. Managing Montgomery and Patton was like refereeing a prize fight where both boxers thought they should be the champion. By September, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. Paris was liberated to scenes of joy that brought tears to hardened soldiers' eyes. Belgium was freed. The German army was retreating on all fronts. Some optimistic officers thought the war might end by Christmas. Montgomery proposed Operation Market Garden. It was bold and completely uncharacteristic of his usual methodical approach. Allied paratroopers would drop behind German lines to capture bridges across the rivers and canals of Holland. British armored divisions would then race up a single highway, link with the paratroopers, cross the Rhine, and drive into Germany's industrial heartland. If it worked, the war really could end by Christmas. It failed catastrophically. The paratroopers landed too far from their objectives. German resistance was far stronger than intelligence predicted. British tanks became trapped on a raised highway with German guns firing from the woods on both sides. Radios malfunctioned. Supplies never arrived. At Arnhem, British paratroopers held their bridge for 9 days against overwhelming odds, waiting for relief that never came. Over 17,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. It was the largest Allied defeat since D-Day, and it had been Montgomery's plan. His response was to blame almost everyone else. The weather had been bad. American paratroopers hadn't fought hard enough, though many died at their posts. His subordinates hadn't executed properly. The one person Montgomery didn't blame was Montgomery. Then came December and Hitler's last desperate gamble. The Führer threw everything remaining into a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, the same route Germany used to invade France in 1940. German panzers smashed through thinly held American lines, creating a huge bulge in the Allied front. American units were surrounded. Ammunition ran low. For several terrifying days, it seemed possible that the Germans might actually split the Allied armies and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. Eisenhower made a difficult decision. He temporarily placed Montgomery in command of American forces north of the Bulge because Montgomery's headquarters was closer and communication lines were breaking down. It was meant to be a temporary tactical arrangement to deal with an emergency. Montgomery treated it as vindication of everything he'd been saying about American leadership. He arrived at American headquarters in his staff car, wearing his famous black beret, and according to American officers present, he looked supremely pleased with himself. He immediately began reorganizing, moving units, and giving orders in a manner that suggested American commanders had been making nothing but mistakes. To be fair, Montgomery helped stabilize the situation. He was experienced and brought British reserves forward to plug dangerous gaps in the line. But his attitude made American officers furious. Then, as the crisis was ending, as American forces were pushing the Germans back and winning the battle, Montgomery held a press conference. He stood before journalists from around the world and took credit for rescuing the Americans. He talked about arriving to find disorganization and confusion. He described the battle as an interesting problem that required proper British leadership to solve. He barely acknowledged the thousands of American soldiers who'd done most of the fighting and dying, including the men of the 101st Airborne who'd held Bastogne against impossible odds. The American reaction was explosive. General Bradley threatened to resign. Even the usually calm Eisenhower was livid. American newspapers published furious editorials. This wasn't just wounded pride anymore. This was about the alliance that was winning the war. But Montgomery kept going. In private conversations with British officials, He began suggesting that perhaps Eisenhower wasn't up to the job of supreme commander. Perhaps the Allies needed a single ground forces commander with full authority. Perhaps that commander should be British. Perhaps that commander should be Bernard Law Montgomery himself. When Winston Churchill heard all of this, he understood immediately what Montgomery apparently could not see. Britain was no longer the dominant partner in the alliance. The United States was providing most of the troops, most of the equipment, most of the ships and planes that were winning the war. Britain was exhausted after 5 years of combat, its economy barely functioning, its cities scarred by bombing, its empire beginning to crack at the edges. The Americans were absolutely essential, and insulting them was more than rude. It was dangerous. Churchill summoned Montgomery. What was said in that meeting remains private, but Montgomery's aide reported that the field marshal emerged looking shaken, which for a man of his iron self-confidence was remarkable. Then Churchill addressed the House of Commons. He didn't name Montgomery directly, but everyone understood. Churchill praised American forces for their courage in the Battle of the Bulge. He called it one of the greatest American battles of the war and made it clear that any suggestion otherwise was not only incorrect but harmful to Allied unity. His famous voice, the instrument that had rallied Britain through the Blitz, carried an unmistakable warning. Churchill also sent Montgomery a private letter. Its contents remained confidential for decades, but historians eventually found it in the archives. The Prime Minister wrote that Montgomery's remarks were damaging the war effort. He pointed out that without American support, Britain could not achieve victory. And he suggested, in language that was diplomatic but firm, that if Montgomery could not work cooperatively with the Americans, then perhaps Montgomery should consider whether he remained the right man for his position. From Winston Churchill, Britain's greatest wartime leader, this was a devastating message. He was telling Britain's most famous general that his job was in jeopardy. Montgomery got the point. He issued clarifying statements praising American courage and leadership. He wrote personal letters of apology to Bradley and Eisenhower. For a while, at least, he learned to moderate his public comments. But American commanders never fully trusted him again. When the Allies crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany in the final months of the war, Eisenhower made sure that American forces led the most important advances. Montgomery's forces advanced too, but they were no longer at the center of operations. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. Montgomery was present when German commanders surrendered all forces in northern Germany, Holland, and Denmark. It should have been a triumphant moment. But everyone knew that the real decision-makers were Eisenhower, Churchill, Stalin, and Truman. Montgomery, for all his ability, had become a supporting player, brilliant but difficult. After the war, Montgomery wrote his memoirs. They were, predictably, lacking in modesty. He claimed most of his decisions had been correct and that failures usually resulted from others not following his plans. American historians responded with their own books, documenting Montgomery's mistakes and his habit of rewriting history in his favor. Churchill, in his own massive history of the Second World War, was more measured. He praised Montgomery's genuine achievements while noting his difficulties working with allies. It was classic Churchill, devastating precisely because it was so fair and restrained. Montgomery lived until 1976, long enough to see himself become a controversial figure among historians. Some emphasized his talents, his meticulous planning, his genuine concern for minimizing casualties among his troops. Others focused on his arrogance, his inability to admit error, his corrosive effect on Allied cooperation. But one thing is certain. In the winter of 1944, when the alliance that defeated Hitler was in danger of fracturing, Churchill understood something Montgomery never grasped. Wars aren't won just by military skill and tactical brilliance. They're won by nations working together, by leaders who understand that sometimes you must set aside pride for the greater good, by statesmen who know when ego threatens everything you're fighting for. Montgomery thought war was about being right and proving your superiority. Churchill knew it was about winning, whatever that required. That's why one man was a talented but troublesome general, and the other became one of the greatest leaders in history.